He taught me everything, except how to say goodbye. I can still see his hands, the way they moved when he sketched, steady, deliberate, like he was carving truth into the canvas itself, each stroke a quiet declaration of something larger than the moment. Professor Daniel Hargrove, my mentor, was a man who spoke so little, but his silence carried a weight that filled every corner of the room, heavy with meaning I couldn't yet grasp. I was 24, a young artist with a sketchbook full of half-formed dreams and a heart that didn't know its own depth, beating too fast under the surface of my skin. He was 42, all sharp angles and quiet restraint, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets he'd never share, like shadows locked behind glass. Every Tuesday, in that cluttered studio that smelled of turpentine and old leather-bound books, he'd lean over my work, his voice soft but precise, pointing out flaws with a gentleness that made my chest ache in ways I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just admiration, just the reverence of a student for her teacher. I told myself it was just respect. But there was something else, something heavier, in the way he lingered just a moment too long, in the way his voice softened when he said my name, Clara. It was like he was saying more than he meant to, like his words were only the surface of a much deeper current, pulling me towards something I wasn't ready to name. I didn't see it then, not fully, but I felt it. A pull, like a tide dragging me under, slow and inevitable, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. He'd stand too close sometimes, his breath catching when our hands brushed over a pencil or a piece of charcoal, the contact so brief but electric, like a spark that burned without flame. But he'd always step back, clear his throat, and point to the canvas like nothing had happened, like the air between us hadn't just thickened with something unspoken. I'd catch him watching me, his gaze heavy with something forbidden, something that made my heart stutter. He was my mentor, my guide, the one person who saw the artist in me before I even believed it myself. But there was a line we never crossed, a boundary he drew in the sand with every careful word, every measured step away. I didn't know what it meant then, but I felt the weight of it, the way it hung in the air between us, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Years later, I found a letter he never sent. It was yellowed, folded so tightly it was almost invisible, tucked inside a book he'd given me, a collection of essays on art that I hadn't opened since I'd left for a new life across the country. It was his goodbye, written the day I walked away, the ink smudged in places, as if he'd held it too long before deciding not to send it. Words he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. Words that broke me when I read them, shattering the fragile story I'd told myself about who we were to each other, about what we'd meant. What's worse, loving someone in silence, or never saying it at all? I'm Clara, and this is the story of the man who shaped me, and the goodbye we never had. I wasn't supposed to be an artist. Growing up, my parents had practical plans for me, accounting, maybe law, something stable, something that would keep me grounded, tethered to a life they could understand. But I'd spend hours sketching in the margins of my notebooks, losing myself in lines and shadows, creating worlds where I didn't have to explain myself, where I could be more than the sum of their expectations. By the time I got to college, I was desperate for someone to see me, really see me, not just the girl who was good at drawing, but the person who felt alive only when she held a pencil, when she could translate the chaos in her head into something tangible. That's when I met Daniel. His studio was like a sanctuary, a place where time slowed down, where the outside world faded away. Canvases were stacked against the walls, some half-finished, others abandoned, gathering dust like forgotten dreams. Half-finished sculptures sat on tables, their shapes vague but heavy with intent, as if they were waiting for someone to finish their story. A single window let in pale, golden light that seemed to soften everything it touched, casting long shadows that felt alive. Daniel wasn't like the other professors, all loud egos and self-important lectures, strutting through lecture halls like they owned the truth. He was quiet, almost severe, with gray flecks in his dark hair and a jaw that clenched when he was lost in thought, as if he was wrestling with something he'd never share. He didn't praise lightly, but when he did, it felt like sunlight breaking through a storm, warm and rare. "Clara," he'd say, his voice low and steady, "you've got something rare. Don't waste it. Those words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of my own doubts, making me believe I could be something more. Our Tuesdays became everything to me. I'd show up early, clutching my sketchbook, my hands trembling under the weight of his gaze, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted so badly to impress him, to earn that quiet nod of approval. He'd critique my work with a precision that was almost surgical, pointing out every flaw, every missed opportunity, but there was always this warmth, this quiet belief in me that no one else had ever shown. I started staying late, asking questions just to hear his voice, to keep him there a little longer, to stretch out the moments when it was just us and the art. He'd talk about art like it was a living thing, how a single line could carry a lifetime of regret, how a shadow could say what words never could, how a canvas could hold a truth too heavy for speech. I'd watch his hands, callous from years of charcoal and clay, moving with a grace that felt almost sacred, and I'd wonder what they'd feel like holding something softer, something other than a pencil or a brush. I'd catch myself staring at the lines around his eyes, the faint creases that hinted at a life he never shared, a life I wanted to know but didn't know how to ask about. He wore no ring, mentioned no family, no partner, no one who filled the spaces of his life outside the studio. But there was a weight to him, like he carried stories he'd locked away long ago, stories he'd buried under layers of silence. Once, I asked about his past, trying to keep it casual as we sipped coffee after class, the paper cups warm in our hands. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and there was a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, or caution. "Some things are better left on the canvas," he said, his voice gentle but firm, and changed the subject, leaving me with more questions than answers, my mind spinning with what he hadn't said. I wasn't naive, even at 24. I knew the way my heart raced when he stood close wasn't just gratitude. I knew the way I lingered in the studio, hoping he'd stay, wasn't just about art. I knew the way I'd catch my breath when he said my name wasn't just admiration for a mentor. But I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into the way his eyes lingered on me. He was my mentor, twice my age, bound by rules neither of us ever spoke of, rules that hung in the air like an invisible wall. There were moments, though, when I thought he might feel it too, when I thought that wall might crumble. One night, we were alone in the studio, cleaning brushes side by side, the room so quiet I could hear the soft clink of brushes against the sink, the faint hum of the radiator in the corner. Our hands touched, just for a second, as we reached for the same jar of water, and he didn't pull away. His eyes met mine, and for one fleeting moment, I saw something raw, something unguarded, something that scared me as much as it thrilled me, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the urge to jump. My breath caught, and I waited, hoping he'd say something, anything, hoping he'd let the moment stretch into something more. But he stepped back, muttered something about deadlines, his voice tight, and left me standing there, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the sink. I went home that night and stared at the ceiling, replaying that moment, wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering if I'd imagined the way his gaze had lingered, the way his breath had faltered. The pull between us grew heavier with every session, like a thread stretched so tight it was ready to snap. I started dressing differently, not in any obvious way, just small things that felt like a secret I was keeping from myself. A sweater that slipped off one shoulder, revealing the curve of my collarbone. A necklace that caught the light when I leaned over my canvas, its pendant resting just above my heart. I wanted him to notice me, not just my art, not just the lines I drew, but the person I was becoming under his guidance. And he did. I could feel it in the way his critique softened, the way his voice caught when he said my name, like he was trying to hold something back. He'd stand closer when he pointed out a shading error, his arm brushing mine, and the air would thicken with everything we didn't say, every glance, every pause a confession we weren't ready to make. But he never crossed that line. He'd catch himself, step back, and the moment would dissolve, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it, if I'd built it all up in my head. One evening, I stayed late to finish a piece, a portrait of a woman looking away, her face half in shadow, her expression caught somewhere between longing and resignation, like she was waiting for something she knew would never come. Daniel was there, grading papers at his desk, the studio so quiet I could hear the scratch of his pen, the faint creak of his chair. I could feel his eyes on me, not the canvas, and it sent a shiver down my spine, a warmth that spread through me like ink in water. "Clara," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Why do you push so hard?" I looked up, startled, my charcoal still in hand, the portrait staring back at me like a mirror. He wasn't talking about the drawing. His eyes were locked on mine, and there was this ache in them, like he was fighting something inside himself, something he couldn't let out. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, so soft I wasn't sure he'd hear it. "I just want to get it right." It was a weak answer, but it was all I could manage with my heart hammering in my chest, with the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. He stood, walked over, and stopped just close enough that I could smell the faint cedar of his cologne, a scent that had become as familiar as the studio itself. He looked at the canvas, but his hand brushed mine as he pointed to a line I'd drawn, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. "You're already there," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, like a confession he hadn't meant to make. "You just don't see it." For a moment, I thought he might say more. I wanted him to. I wanted him to break every rule, to tell me what he was holding back, to let the thread snap and see where it took us. But he didn't. He stepped away, cleared his throat, and said, "It's late. You should go." His voice was clipped, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me, like he was rebuilding that wall between us brick by brick. I left, my chest tight with something I couldn't name, frustration, longing, confusion, all tangled together into a knot I couldn't unravel. After that night, things changed. He was still kind, still brilliant, but there was a distance now, a wall he'd put up that I couldn't climb. He stopped staying late with me, stopped lingering over my work. His critiques were sharper, more formal, like he was trying to keep me at arm's length, to keep himself safe. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, but he'd look away when I met his eyes, his jaw tight, his hands clenched as if he was holding himself back. I started to wonder if I'd imagined it all, the glances, the touches, the weight of his silence. Had I read too much into it? Had I seen what I wanted to see, built a story out of nothing but my own longing? I tried to focus on my work, to pour everything into my art, but every sketch felt like a confession I didn't know how to make, every line a question I was too afraid to ask. Then came the day I got the offer. A gallery in Seattle wanted my work, a small show, but it was a start, a chance to step into the world I dreamed of since I was a girl sketching in the margins of my notebooks. It was everything I'd worked for, everything I'd thought I wanted, but it meant leaving. Leaving the studio, leaving the golden light, leaving him. I told Daniel in the studio, my voice shaking with excitement, and something else I couldn't name, something that felt like loss even before it happened. I expected. I don't know what. Pride, maybe? A smile, a nod, something to show he was happy for me. But his face went still, like I'd taken something from him, like I'd stolen the air from the room. "That's incredible, Clara," he said, but his voice was hollow, like the words were stuck in his throat, like he was forcing them out. He hugged me, brief, careful, like he was afraid to hold on too long, afraid of what it might mean. I wanted to ask him to say something, to tell me what he was thinking, to give me something to hold on to. But I couldn't find the words. I packed my things, said goodbye, and left for Seattle, carrying the weight of his silence with me, heavier than any suitcase. Years passed, and I built a life, or at least the outline of one. A career, or the start of one, with shows in small galleries and reviews that called my work promising, but never quite enough. But the art world was brutal, colder than I'd imagined, full of sharp edges and sharper critics. I was lonelier than I'd ever been, surrounded by people but missing something I couldn't name. I'd think of Daniel sometimes, his quiet intensity, the way he made me feel seen when I felt invisible, the way his voice had anchored me. I'd wonder if he thought of me, if he ever stood in that studio and remembered our Tuesdays, if he ever looked at a canvas and saw the girl I'd been. I tried to push him out of my mind, to focus on my work, to build something new, but he was there in every shadow I painted, every line I drew, every moment of quiet when the world felt too heavy. Then, one day, I found it, a book he'd given me, a collection of essays on art that I hadn't touched since I'd moved to Seattle. I opened it, and there it was, a letter, folded so tightly it was almost invisible, his handwriting on the envelope, dated the day I left, the ink smudged as if he'd held it too long before deciding not to send it. I sat on my apartment floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I opened it, my hands trembling, the paper crinkling under my fingers, and read. Clara, it began. I've spent years teaching you to see the world, but I never taught you to see me. I don't know if I'm brave enough to send this, but I need you to know. My breath caught, my vision blurring as I read on. He wrote about the moments we'd shared, the ones I thought I'd imagined, the way his heart raced when our hands brushed, the way he'd fought himself every time he wanted to reach for me, to pull me closer, to cross that line. He wrote about the rules he'd clung to, the boundaries he'd drawn to protect me, to protect himself, to keep us both from falling into something we couldn't come back from. He wrote about letting me go, believing it was the right thing, believing I deserved a life bigger than the one he could offer, a life free from the weight of his feelings. You were my greatest work, he wrote, and my greatest regret. The words blurred as tears fell, soaking the paper, and I pressed it to my chest, as if I could hold onto him through the ink. I cried until I couldn't breathe, the letter crumpled in my hands, its edges soft from my grip. He'd loved me. In silence, in secret, in all the ways he couldn't say. And I'd never known. I'd walked away, thinking he didn't care, thinking I was just a student to him, just another name on his roster. The weight of it was unbearable, the years we'd lost, the words we'd never said, the moments we'd let slip through our fingers. I read the letter again and again, each word cutting deeper, each word a reminder of what we could have been if we'd been braver, if we'd been honest. I saw our Tuesdays in a new light, the way he'd linger over my work, the way his voice would catch when he said my name, the way his eyes would soften, just for a moment, before he looked away. I'd thought it was just me, just a young girl's crush on a man who saw her potential. But it wasn't. He'd felt it too, and he buried it, locked it away behind those careful words, those measured steps, that unyielding silence. I started painting again, but everything I made was him. Shadows of his hands, the curve of his jaw, the weight of his silence in every stroke, every smudge of charcoal. My work grew darker, heavier, like I was trying to purge the ache he'd left behind, to paint him out of me. I'd sit in my tiny Seattle apartment, the letter on my desk, its corners curling from the times I'd unfolded and refolded it, and I'd stare at it, wondering why he hadn't sent it. Was it fear? Duty? Did he think I wouldn't understand, that I'd turn away, that I'd see him differently? Did he think I was too young, too naive, to carry the weight of his feelings? I wanted to call him, to write back, to ask why he'd let me go without a word, why he'd let me walk away carrying nothing but questions. But I didn't. I was afraid of what I'd find, afraid he'd moved on, afraid he'd forgotten me, or worse, that he hadn't, that he was still out there, carrying the same ache I was. I tried to move on with my life, to fill the emptiness with noise. I dated, went to gallery openings, smiled through the small talk and the critiques, played the part of the up-and-coming artist. But at night, when the world was quiet, when the city outside my window felt too big, I'd think of him. I'd wonder if he was still in that studio, teaching someone else, shaping their dreams the way he'd shaped mine. I'd wonder if he was as lonely as I was, if he ever looked at a canvas and saw my face, if he ever regretted the silence that had grown between us. I'd hold the letter and trace his words, trying to find some piece of him in the ink, some clue to who he'd been, who he was now. I wanted to go back, to walk into that studio and demand answers, to ask why he'd let me go, why he'd chosen silence over truth. But I didn't know what I'd say, didn't know if I could face him, knowing what I knew now, knowing the weight of what we'd lost. Then I got the call. A friend from back home, her voice heavy with news I wasn't ready to hear, news that hit me like a punch to the chest. Daniel was sick. Not just sick, dying. A slow, quiet illness that had crept up over years, eating away at him while I was building my life in Seattle, while I was painting shadows of him on every canvas. She said he still taught, still sat in that studio, but he was frilier now, his hands less steady, his eyes more tired, carrying a weariness that went beyond the physical. I booked a flight the next day, my heart a tangle of fear and urgency, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say, everything I needed to know. I didn't know what I'd find when I saw him, didn't know if I could find the words to bridge the years between us, but I needed to see him. I needed to know if the letter was real, if the man who'd written it was still there, if there was still time to say the things we'd left unsaid. The studio hadn't changed. Same cluttered shelves, same half-finished sculptures, same golden light filtering through the window, softer now in the late afternoon. He was sitting at his desk, thinner than I remembered, his hair almost entirely gray, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his illness. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment he didn't speak. Just stared, like I was a ghost, like he couldn't believe I was real, standing there in the doorway. "Clara," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, and it broke something in me, a dam I'd been holding back for years. I didn't plan what came next. I just sat across from him, the letter in my hand, its edges worn from all the times I'd held it, read it, carried it like a wound. "Why didn't you send it?" I asked, my voice shaking, small and raw, barely holding together. He looked at the paper, then at me, and his eyes were wet, shining in the dim light, reflecting the golden glow of the studio. "I thought you deserved better," he said, his voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear it, each word heavy with years of regret. "Someone who could give you the world, not just a corner of it." His words were a confession, a wound, a truth he'd carried alone for too long. We talked for hours, the studio fading around us, the world outside shrinking to nothing. We talked about art, about the years we'd lost, about the moments we'd shared and the ones we'd let slip away. He told me he'd followed my career, kept every article about my shows, clipped them from newspapers and tucked them away like treasures, like pieces of me he could still hold on to. He'd been proud, he said, but he'd never reached out, never let himself bridge the distance. "I didn't want to hold you back," he said, and I wanted to scream that he hadn't, that he'd been the one thing that kept me going, the one person who'd made me believe I could be more than I was. But I didn't. I just held his hand, feeling the fragility of his fingers, the calluses still there but softer now, worn down by time and illness. We sat in silence sometimes, the weight of all the things we never said settling between us, heavy but not unbearable, like a shared burden we could finally carry together. It was enough, in that moment, to just be there, to feel the warmth of his hand in mine, to know that the letter was real, that the man who'd written it was still here, even if only for a little while. He died 3 months later. I was there, at the hospital, when he slipped away. It was quiet, like he'd always been, no grand gestures, no final speeches, just a soft breath, and then he was gone. His last words to me were, "Keep painting, Clara. You're still my greatest work." I held on to those words, let them sink into me, let them carry me through the grief that followed, a grief so deep it felt like it would swallow me whole. I went back to Seattle, but I wasn't the same. I paint every day now, and every stroke feels like a conversation with him, a way to keep him close, to keep him alive in the lines and shadows. The letter sits on my desk, its words worn but still sharp, a reminder of what we had and what we lost. I don't know if I'll ever stop wondering what might have been, if he'd sent it, if I'd stayed, if we'd been braver, if we'd let ourselves cross that line and face whatever came next. His greatest lesson was the one he never shared, that love, even unspoken, leaves a mark you can't erase, a mark that lingers in every quiet moment, every empty space. I walk past galleries now, see my work on their walls, and I think of him. The man who saw me when I was invisible, who shaped me with his silence as much as his words, who gave me the tools to build a life but kept a piece of himself hidden. The man who loved me in secret, in all the ways he couldn't say, until it was too late. I don't know if he was right to let me go, to choose silence over truth. I don't know if I was right to leave, to walk away without asking the questions that burned in me. But I know this: some goodbyes are louder than words, and they haunt you forever, echoing in the spaces where love was felt but never spoken. Have you ever let someone go without saying how you felt? Share below. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. What's the goodbye you wish you'd said? Tell us in the comments.